In particular, of course, we've had the surge in inflation. It really says something that people are quite excited that the latest inflation numbers showed a fall from 11.1% to 10.7%, and that was actually seen as good news, even though that's just so far ahead of the Bank of England's inflation target of 2%.
Well, welcome to another instalment of our Year in Review series on the IEA London YouTube channel. In this instalment, we're looking at the economy and monetary policy over 2022. And I'm joined by independent economist and an economics fellow here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Julian Jessop. Julian, welcome.
Thank you.
I fear that all of the instalments we're doing this series are going to be a bit bleak and gloomy. Give us your 30,000 foot sort of overview of how the economy and monetary policy in the UK has looked over 2022. Pretty grim, isn't it?
Well, it has been. It's been another difficult, but also rather strange year. I can't remember the last year now where we've had what we might call normal economic conditions, where people are worried about inflation going up or down by a few tenths of percentage point, or unemployment going up or down by a few tenths of percentage point. Instead, we've had enormous swings in the economy over the last several years, and that's continued this year as well. In particular, of course, we've had the surge in inflation. It really says something that people are quite excited that the latest inflation numbers showed a fall from 11.1% to 10.7%, and that was actually seen as good news, even though that's just so far ahead of the Bank of England's inflation target of 2%. So people are quite rightly worried about inflation and paying their bills over the winter. On top of that, it does look like the UK economy, in common with others in Europe and in North America, is heading into some sort of recession over the next year or two. So economic conditions are clearly very, very tough. But there's one thing that is odd about this downturn, which is that the labour market is still very strong. If you look at the unemployment numbers in particular, they're still very low. If you do want a job, it's relatively easy to find one. So job security is still relatively high. And I think that's one of the reasons why hopefully this recession won't be too deep, because people will still be confident in their jobs, and those who were lucky enough to build up savings over the pandemic will be able to spend them to support their standard of living despite falling incomes after adjusting for inflation. So the labour market is the one big hope. But overall, it's been a pretty tough year, and there are lots of question marks about policy, both monetary policy and fiscal policy.
Let's parcel some of these things out then, the inflation rate into double digits. How did we get here? Who's to blame? I mean, let me sort of put, I guess, the very simplistic case against the Bank of England. They sort of have one club in their golf set, namely dialing up interest rates in order to keep inflation at that 2% level. You might argue they've been asleep at the wheel, right? I mean, I appreciate interest rates are being dialed up, and just last week we saw them dialed up again.
Yeah.
But is this a bit too little, too late? If you've got one target, the inflation rate, and one tool, the interest rate, I'm a bit flummoxed that this wasn't dealt with in anticipation of these numbers rather than in response to double-digit inflation.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to the Bank of England, if they have made a mistake, it's a mistake that lots of other central banks have made too. So the inflation numbers in the UK are pretty similar to the average in the rest of Europe, and the Fed has in the United States has had to deal with high inflation and had to raise interest rates more now than it would otherwise have done. So to some extent, this is a global shock. But I still think you're right to say that just because other central banks have made the same mistake doesn't mean we should let off the Bank of England. You're right to mention interest rates, but I think there's something else going on as well, which is money printing. I think that was the bigger factor. In the early stages of the pandemic, the Bank of England, like many other central banks, printed enormous amounts of money and pumped it into the economy under the policy of quantitative easing. And so I think to some extent what we're seeing now is another legacy of that. If you pump enormous amounts of money into an economy which is constrained on the supply side, first by COVID and then by the shortages of fuel and energy and other types of energy, and also food because of what's happening in Russia, then economics 101 will tell you the outcome is going to be inflation. And I think that's the big mistake the Bank of England and other central banks have made, is not paying enough attention to those good old-fashioned monetary aggregates. You don't have to be a die-hard monetarist to think that ignoring 15% annual growth in the money supply was a big policy mistake. The Bank of England is starting to correct that now. It is raising rates back towards more normal levels, and is also started to reverse quantitative easing. So it's starting to sell back some of those bonds that it had bought with newly created money. So the bank is starting to correct that mistake. But I think at the end of the day, that is the main reason why overall inflation is as high as it is now.
That's intriguing. Is this sort of the chickens coming home to roost after a very long time? I mean, for those who have been concerned about the money printing, or in the new vernacular, quantitative easing approach, have sort of been expecting this surge in inflation to happen a lot earlier, right? But was the money sort of parked after the global financial crash, sort of helping capitalize banks rather than, if you like, hitting the real normal economy, and is now beginning to hit the normal economy? Because we've been doing this money printing for a very long time indeed, and only seem to be hitting the inflationary consequences of it now, which just seems a bit curious to me. Why the long delay? I mean, over a decade of delay really before it's kicked in.
I mean, you're right. I think the experience of the global financial crisis did make people complacent about the inflationary impact of printing money. But a number of points. First of all, there was actually a lot of inflation after the global financial crisis. It was just that it was hidden in asset prices, not necessarily in the consumer prices that people pay more attention to. Also, the degree of quantitative easing has been much, much bigger this time around, and the money has been injected directly into the economy through government spending, because a lot of what quantitative easing effectively has done is allow governments to spend enormous amounts of money on pandemic support and other things. So it's been injected into the economy much more than the previous rounds of QE were, which was largely about supporting the financial system. And also the economy this time around has been much more constrained on the supply side. So because you've had shortages of all sorts of things, energy, food, labor, and so on, which you didn't have in the wake of the global financial crisis. Then remember, we had pretty high unemployment. So, lots of underused resources. So there's a whole combination of factors why, this time around it was indeed different, that, quantitative easing has led to much, much higher inflation than we otherwise would have had.
Right. Now, you mentioned in your overview, Julian, that if there's something to be somewhat optimistic about or pleased about, it might be in the labour market, that we haven't seen soaring unemployment. I think you're right, I can't remember the number now, but there are vast numbers of job vacancies that if you're sort of looking for work, your prospects of finding gainful employment seem high. But I want to cast a little dark cloud of suspicion over this. Isn't there an underlying feature that actually probably caused by the COVID pandemic, amongst other things, that just vast numbers of people have chose to exit the labour market? I mean, one theory I've heard that was sort of when we got into lockdown, a lot of people potentially sped up their retirement. They might have been retiring in a year or two anyway. They took that as the opportunity to quit the workforce altogether rather than returning to work when sort of something approaching normality returned. So is this in part, these large numbers of sort of job vacancies, and it's easy to get a job if you want one, really a reflection of, if you like, the chosen idleness, I'm not necessarily blaming that, of so many people exiting the labour market?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the tightness of the labour market at the moment is both a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, it's clearly a good thing if you're worried about job security, and it does mean that people are getting bigger wage increases than they would otherwise have done. I mean, not enough to keep pace with inflation, but it could have been worse. But it's bad news in other respects. I mean, clearly it's a problem for employers who are struggling to get the staff that they need. And it's also a reflection of underlying problems, as you say. One thing is that lots of older people have retired earlier than might otherwise have done. They need to be tempted back into work again, and actually higher wages are part of the solution to that problem rather than a problem in themselves. Another important thing is a big increase in long-term sickness, which again, may be a legacy of COVID. It may also be, a problem to do with the latest recurring crisis in the in the NHS, which is clearly an organisation in huge trouble. So despite the fact that there's more money being pumped into the NHS, more staff in the NHS, they're actually treating fewer patients now than they were before the pandemic. So I think that's got to be a factor contributing to longer term sickness as well. So it's older workers and the long term sick who are not available. Another factor that obviously a lot of other people might mention is Brexit. I think the impact of that is exaggerated. I mean, it's certainly true that a lot of EU citizens have gone home over the last few years and not come back, but that's partly because of the COVID itself, and they've been reluctant to move internationally. There's no shortage of people in the EU who are eligible to come and live and work here if they.
I thought our net migration was the highest ever, about 500,000 or something.
Yes, that's the headline number is the highest ever, but there's still almost nobody coming here from the EU. So that net migration figure is dominated by two things. One is people from outside the EU, and the other is students. So of course, by and large, are not coming here to work. But you're right. If you look at the overall net migration figures, there's no evidence there that Brexit has contributed to labour shortages in aggregate, though of course it might have done in individual sectors where we're particularly dependent on particular types of worker coming from the EU.
Let's turn and look a bit at the fiscal side of the equation. I mean, you've mentioned that the sort of loose monetary approach, quantitative easing, is being unwound. We're in a pretty grim fiscal position, aren't we? I mean, does one suppose actually that if we are in a recession or heading into a recession, that the tools the government has at its disposal are rather more limited than they might be in normal times, that there isn't much room for monetary manoeuvre or indeed fiscal manoeuvre? Talk me through the size and the problem of the so-called fiscal black hole that the government's dealing with. I must admit, I've been confused about these numbers. It's been mentioned that I think either 40 or 50 or 60 billion is the fiscal black hole. It actually seems to me that if we were to look at it sensibly, the fiscal black hole is a lot bigger than that, certainly over the medium to long run. So give us a pen picture of the fiscal position.
Well, I have really no idea what the fiscal black hole is. I think, as an economist, if you give me a number, I could probably get there one way or another, whether that's a huge number or a very small one. The problem with the fiscal black hole estimates is that there are a lot of components that go into calculating those numbers that are basically just assumptions or guesswork. So for a start, when people talk about a fiscal black hole, they're talking about the difference between spending and revenues in several years' time, maybe 3 years' time, 5 years' time. So first of all, you're forecasting the difference between two very big numbers over actually quite a long period of time. Also, a lot depends on what you assume about economic growth and inflation over that period, but also variables like what's going to happen to interest rates and commodity prices, the oil price and natural gas price. So there are lots of assumptions in there. Another element is that what is your benchmark? And typically the benchmark is you're measuring where the deficit is likely to be against where you think it needs to be in order to meet the government's fiscal rules. But those fiscal rules are made up by the government. If it had a different set of fiscal rules, then you'd come up with a different number for the black hole. And finally, I think actually probably the most important point is that there's very little thought here given to the various feedback loops here. Now, suppose I said that there's a 50 billion black hole in the public finances and the government decided to close that tomorrow by raising taxes by 50 billion. I can pretty much guarantee that wouldn't work because that would tip the economy into an even deeper recession than you otherwise have had. So the tax revenues would fall, welfare spending would increase. And so you're constantly chasing your tail. And I think that's one of the big concerns that many of us have had, whatever your political perspective, whether you're on the right or left or nowhere in particular, that there is a danger that by lurching back into this policy of tax increases and spending cuts when the economy is heading into recession, instead of filling the black hole, you actually just make it bigger than it otherwise have been. The one saving grace there is actually the latest fiscal statement budget, whatever you like to call it, was actually quite sensible because in the short term, it did actually loosen fiscal policy. It spent a bit more on, support with the energy crisis and, a little bit more for public services where the money was needed the most. The tax increases were largely delayed for a few years, but that's only a small silver lining, because everybody knows that, you know, under the current strategy, we're going to get significant austerity over the next few years, at least as much on the tax side as on the spending
Was
side.
that smart economics or cynical politics that you might presume that the present government thinks its prospects of still being in power after 2025 are somewhat limited, and therefore, rather than carrying out any of the medicine or the pain or the difficult decisions now, you sort of say, well, you know, 2025 is when all the, you know, the nasty stuff will happen in terms of spending cuts. So do you think that was a sensible piece of economics or a bit of cynical electoral manoeuvring?
Yeah, well, I think it's possible for it to be both. I mean, if I believe that there was a big fiscal black hole and it needed to be filled by tax increases, then the way that they've done it is probably the most sensible thing to do, which is to delay the main bite from the tax increases for a few years. Though, of course, don't forget that even before the latest budget, there are still some quite big tax increases coming in April, particularly hitting the business sector through the increase in corporation tax. So I think pressing ahead with that was still a mistake. In terms of the bigger political picture, I mean, yeah, it does seem to have left the next government with a bit of a problem. And if it is a Labour government, as it looks like it may well be, are they going to stick to those fiscal plans or not? You know, what are they going to reverse if anything? There's also a more positive way of looking at that, because the tax increases, the bulk of them have been delayed for a few years. It is possible that they don't actually have to be implemented. Now, if the economy does perform better than expected over the next few years, as actually I think it may well do, then it's quite possible that the public finances look a bit rosier, and then run up to the next election, the Chancellor will be able to say, actually, we've managed the economy really well, we've got some political stability here, some market stability, and actually we can afford to be a bit more generous on tax than we would otherwise have been. Right.
Obviously, over 2022, Julian, we've had three different governments, three different administrations. And the very brief 44-day period of the second administration was quite distinct from either the first or the third, which I think seemed to be both the Boris Johnson and the Rishi Sunak administration seem to be pursuing a relatively similar economic policy. So let's touch on the approach of the Liz Truss Kwasi-Kwarteng administration. Their approach was to, I think, pick up on some of the threads that you were saying, that increasing taxes might look like it's plugging a black hole, but is injurious to growth or tips you further into recession. So the long-term or even the relatively short-term dynamic effects of it are bad for the economy. So their approach in the Kwarteng mini budget was, we're actually going to cut taxes. We've got to have a plan to get growth back into the economy. The tax burden needs to fall from an extraordinary high at the moment. It's the highest as a proportion of national income for, I think, 70 years or so. And we're going to have a whole load of supply side deregulatory reform around, I don't know, planning, financial services, rescind large chunks of the inherited EU law that we haven't tackled really since Brexit. What went wrong? Why did this blow up so spectacularly quickly, that plan? And what would you say to those who said, well, this approach of having sort of rather lower taxes to encourage growth and deregulating parts of the economy seems impossible? I mean, it was sort of spat out, vomited out by the markets, the whole government collapses, and we're back to the sort of pre-Truss plan. Why did it all blow up?
Well, I mean, obviously I should declare a small interest here, because as many people probably know, I was involved in advising Liz Truss and Kwasi-Kwarteng before they took up their roles. So I had a small part to play in this. I think a number of points. First of all, I think the overall strategy was the correct one. I think it was important to do a number of things. One was to support the economy in the short term through tax cuts and the additional support with energy bills. So I think that approach was right. And also a very strong focus on boosting the supply side of the economy in other ways. So I think the Liz Truss administration, brief though it was probably more committed to things like planning reform than any previous administration has been for a very, very long time. So I think overall strategy was correct. I think the problem was the timing and the delivery. If we take the mini budget in particular, most of what was in that mini budget was actually widely anticipated. So if you look at the big headline numbers, that was the energy price guarantee, it was the cuts in corporation tax and and getting rid of the surcharge on national insurance. So in terms of billions of pounds, that was where almost all the work was being done. The thing that the markets didn't like was the surprise announcements on income tax. So getting rid of
rounding errors, right? I mean,
I know. I think it's only 2 billion out of a total program of close to 100 billion. But I think it just tipped the markets over the edge. The markets were already very nervous, for a number of reasons. I mean, like it or not, you're getting rid of the permanent secretary of the Treasury was seen as damaging the institutions. Not getting the OBR to do the full forecast round alongside the budget. So the markets were already a bit nervous, and then that just tipped them over the edge, particularly because Kwasi Kwarteng over the weekend on the Sunday seemed to double down.
So we're going to have more of the same. This is just the start, right?
Exactly. So I think that was part of it. I also think there's quite a lot of bad luck involved, frankly. I mean, the markets were nervous also about global things. So the pound was weak against the dollar because the dollar itself was strong across the board. So the pound was under pressure, and it looked like the pound was being singled out, when in fact, it was largely a dollar story. There was then the turmoil in the mortgage market, which was sort of triggered by the response to the mini budget, but then made a lot worse by something that even I was completely unaware of, which was this big particular problem in the gilt market because of the way pension funds were doing something called liability-driven investment strategies, another one of these complicated, possibly the ABC of toxic derivatives that tends to trip up the financial system and the wider economy from time to time. So that, by the way, another finger pointed at the Bank of England as one of the regulators of all of this. So that exacerbated the problems in the bond market. So I think there was an element of bad luck in there. But as Napoleon said, I mean, he used to like lucky generals. And I think that Kwasi Kwarteng sort of ran into some of his own bad luck by not handling the markets better than he did.
What about, because I guess from a sort of free market IEA style perspective, the criticism, which perhaps we could have been louder about at the time, a good number of IEA spokesmen took different views on the mini budget, but probably on balance, like the general direction of travel. But we pointed out at the time, perhaps a bit too sotto voce, but nevertheless did point out, where on earth is the fiscal consolidation?
Yeah, I think
unfunded tax cuts. There didn't seem to be a plan to say, whatever, we're going to abandon the triple lock on the state pension, or all public sector pay is going to be capped, or, pick whatever you're going to do. And indeed, spending was being greatly enhanced by the colossal energy price guarantee. I mean, an absolute bazooka. I mean, some people said to me it's the biggest single government spending program ever announced in British history. So whether you think that was right or wrong, I think it was overdone, but there didn't seem to be any nudge or a wink that we were going to be able to find savings in any area of government.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I push back strongly against the idea that this has been a failure of free market economics in any sense. I make 3 points there. One is the point you've just made, that there's nothing particularly free markety about tax cuts that aren't balanced in some way by restraint on public spending. The second point is that, I mean, many people on the free market side, I mean, particularly most people at the IEA were very critical of the energy price guarantee. I was a bit more sympathetic to it because of the the extraordinary circumstances at the time. I think you needed to go a bit further than you would normally do, but certainly most free market thinkers were very critical of that. There's also the point that it seems odd that the government basically ignored the concerns of the markets. If you're a free marketeer, then you have to take some account of what financial markets are thinking, and completely sidelining the OBR as well. I was uncomfortable with that because the OBR as an independent institution is one of the ways that the government is kept in check. And if we had a rabid left-wing government that was spending willy-nilly, then I would expect the OBR to pull them up as well. So there's nothing particularly free markety in sidelining them. And then the final point is, of course, the most free market points of Trussonomics, all the supply side reforms, was never actually done, and largely seems to have been shelved. A few elements have survived. So the government is starting to do a little bit more on financial services and so on, but big bold supply side reforms
or investment zones, as they were called, deregulation in various areas. Yeah, planning reform seems dead. And I think the financial reforms, financial services reforms, whilst welcome, are relatively modest under Jeremy Hunt, aren't they?
Yeah, I'm not going to give up completely. I've got this rather naff analogy here, which is the tortoise and the hare. So I think Truss and Kwarteng were very much the hare. They felt that they only had 2 years to get things done, if only, of course, in the end, less than 2 months. But they felt they needed to rush, and I think they decided to do the things, to pull the levers that they could pull quickly, namely tax cuts, before moving on to the broader, more difficult things. It is possible that Rishi Sunak will be the tortoise that ultimately wins the race, because he is traditionally seen as a free marketeer, one of the first advocates of a more extensive policy of free ports, for example. So it's possible that he will deliver. But given what's happening in the opinion polls, the weakness of the economy at the moment, is he really going to take any big tough decisions? I'm not sure.
I want to finish up with 2 questions. I mean, it's been a fairly bleak picture, not universally bleak, but a fairly bleak picture that you painted, Julian. Do we expect 2023 to be better? If in a year's time we're having the same conversation, do you think we'll be within sight of the sunlit uplands, or are we expecting 2023 to be even tougher and more challenging economically than 2022?
Well, put it like this, I think 2023 will be better than expected. It's not necessarily a high
low
hurdle.
bar,
yeah, exactly. But there's talk of a deep, long recession, and the UK performing a lot worse than countries in the rest of Europe in particular. I think actually there are some reasons to be hopeful. In particular, actually, the outlook for inflation itself. I think inflation will fall pretty sharply next year. It's partly just the maths of it, the base effects with the big increases in food and energy prices dropping out of the annual comparison. But more fundamentally, there's plenty of evidence in business surveys that some of those supply side problems are starting to ease. And monetary growth has slowed pretty sharply. And if you take a sort of monetarist perspective on inflation, that's probably the single most important development there. So I think we might get some pleasant surprises on inflation. I also think the experience of the pandemic has shown that when it can work, the free market economy is actually pretty flexible at adapting to shocks. We have had a long period now of relatively high energy prices, for example, and the enormous market incentives for people to economize on energy. We've had a lot of supply chain disruption, but supply chains have now been rebuilt and are probably more resilient. There's plenty of scope for big increase in investment. Investment's been weak for a number of years, but lots of companies actually a reasonably good position financially to invest more if they've got the confidence to do so. So I think we might be okay. I mean, growth will be a lot weaker than many of us would have hoped for, but I think
not as bad as many are expecting, you're saying.
Yeah, and also I think the labour market will hold up a bit better than people fear as well. And people will be struggling to pay their bills, but there is a lot of support in there. Some people would actually say too much support for people on low incomes, but the flip side of all that government spending is a lot of it is going in the right direction. So I think the economy will do okay, which isn't a brilliant thing to say, but I don't think it will be the massive stagflation that people fear.
We'll muddle through. And then exactly. my last question, Julie, I'm asking each of my guests on these year in review 2022 installments in their particular area to give me a score out of 10 for 2022. So what would be your overall aggregate for how good or bad a year that 2022 was as far as the British economy and economic policy is concerned? Naught could not be worse. Everything is the apocalypse is here, and 10 is nothing could have been better. Where would you be on that 0 to 10 spectrum for the last year in terms of the performance of the British economy and the policy approach that we're adopting to deal with it?
Well, there's so many different episodes during the year. I think it's hard to give a single mark, but I'll probably have to come up with something around about 4. So, muddling along, but could have done an awful lot better.
Okay, so bleak, but not that bleak. And perhaps next year, bleak, but not quite as bleak as some are predicting. Julian, thanks very much for your time and joining us. Great to have you with us on the IEA London YouTube channel as always. Have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. For all of those of you watching, if you've enjoyed the program, please make sure you hit the thumbs up button. And if you're not yet a subscriber to the IEA London YouTube channel, please subscribe by hitting the red subscription bar at the side of the screen and the notification bell. That way you will be kept up to date with all upcoming IEA London YouTube output. Have a very, very good festive period. Thanks for joining us. Over and out. Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.